Okay, great. All right, so this is our last session together, and we thought we would explore some of the more general themes, and also hear what questions you have, the things that are percolating for you, and you know, where are your questions? Where's your juice at the moment? Who's coming in?
Yes, the Meridian.
Yeah, Lawrence.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how to answer those questions
Mm-hmm.
that are this week's questions. I'm like, yeah, this would be cool if I could do that.
Mm-hmm.
So I am very curious about that. Going back, and I wouldn't mind talking about that a little bit. Otherwise, I will go back and research, find out.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Well, my question is not necessarily answerable. Apparently that may be Clara. So
Yeah.
noticing a little.
Yes, sir.
But for me, I've been a part of a lot of different experiments in what I call me space explorations, and what I'm really interested in is which ways, as we experiment with this, will fuel our aliveness and can be playful. Because, we're facing so many big things right now. I mean, just this week, let's only look at the refugee situation in the Mediterranean. This just huge situation. And that's only one thing of hundreds. And yet I feel that being feeling alive around those challenges and being as playful as we can, even in the midst of crisis, will be great gifts that we can give one another. And we can be playful and still be holding sacred space and being respectful simultaneously, in my humble opinion. So that's one of the things I've been wondering about this week in light of the questions that you offered, because they were really good questions. And as I kind of, went through my own review, that was something that I felt, for me, that we haven't had a lot of conversation around yet, which doesn't mean, that's not still possible. But that's what is up for me. Thank you.
Mary, I really appreciate you sharing that, because just recently we had a real backslide. We had saved our one remaining watershed in Anchorage, and now it's been put back into place. And it's I tend to get so serious over things, and how to retain that playfulness. And when there's it's very difficult to understand people's thinking, because this road, which will be like $30 million, 8/10 of a road, at the same time that our legislature has just cut millions and millions from our university budget. So how to retain that playfulness, when you are going into yet another community meeting, writing papers again to try to once again that we thought we had been successful, and then to learn that, my God, here it is again. So how to retain that playfulness?
Why is playfulness important?
Well, we have because this is all a playground, right? This is really a playground, even though we might not see it as such.
I don't know. I think that's an assumption you're making, right?
Well, I mean, I don't. It's not an assumption for me. It is the foundation on which I stand, and I understand that it's arguable for some, but I believe that. So it's a belief. I would call it a belief. I believe that we are here to explore and learn how to get along. And one of the questions that we often ask in one of the organizations that I'm a part of, is how can I see this person as my ally and my teacher? How can I see the situation as my ally and my teacher? How can I see whatever is happening as my ally and my teacher? And this is in direct contrast to this thousands of year old paradigm that we've all been embedded in, which is filled with blame, shame, criticism, scapegoating, and all that goes along with that, which inspires a fear paradigm, which is just gripping everybody right now. And there are so many other, our complexities course, there's so many other complex and complicated things that enter into it. But coming with the idea, I think of Nelson Mandela a lot as one example, that, he could have approached his situation in all sorts of different ways, but he kept framing it with a positive outcome. Now, it's like Václav Havel says, I quote him all the time, it's not that hope is not that we know how it's going to turn out, but that we're choosing what's correct because, that's the correct thing to do. We're choosing what we're choosing because that's the correct thing to do, and no matter how it turns out. So for me, in my life, I have found that being playful and open and curious and being in conversations of discovery support the collective discovery of possibilities more than being stuck in a position or being closed or being uber serious. So that's what's true for me. Mm-hmm. And in the experiments that I've done, the more playful communities and the more loving communities are the ones that actually get more positive results than the ones that are uber serious, which reminds me of what Thomas said last week about how some organizations that claim to be evolving what I call moi space are actually fairly egoic. And so that's my response. Thank you for asking.
Do you mind if I bring in one of my German classics? A quote I love to quote. It's Friedrich Schiller, one of our big poets, next to Goethe. And there's one quote he's very known for because he was a theorist about theater and aesthetics and history a lot. And the quote is, human only become human when they start to play. And this quote is very popular to be quoted. Interesting enough, there's a second part of the quote that people usually don't use, although it's coming right after, is people only play when they take the play serious. And I love the composition of both parts because as I understand you about the playfulness, and particularly when you bring in someone like Nelson Mandela or also Václav Havel, particular Mandela, but also Václav Havel in his way, they were very positive people. I mean, you just saw the love pouring out of this man. At the same time, and I guess that's not what you mean, but it's important to distinguish, he was not just playing around. He was not just playing around. He was on a mission, and he achieved something with what he was doing because it's rare in history, but I would say with him in South Africa, it's the case, it was because of him that South Africa did not end up in the bloodbath that everyone predicted. Because he, after his, what was it, I think 25 years in prison, and in harsh prison on this Robben Island, he would have had all the reasons to be hateful or revengeful or ask for justice. Just to ask for justice would have been harsh enough for the situation, but he had something where he felt this would bring South Africa down. So there's something where, and also, I mean, when when you every time when you saw him on TV, until his late time, there was so much joy pouring out of this man. It's unbelievable. But gosh, if I may say so, he was a serious guy. He was a serious guy. And so the way I understand you, how can you be so playful, or can we do this in a playful way that really appreciates the positivity of life, at the same time not just playing around?
Yes, and I think the important part about play is the part about connection and staying connected.
I'd like to say that as a generally serious person, but I do get silly once in a while, I feel as if confidence is one of the things, like confidence. But the first thing that came to me when this conversation began was the most important thing isn't what you're doing, it's who you are, as we've heard all along. It's who you are being. No, Mr. Mandela was so strongly positive and joyful, and there are many others we could cite but they're so strong and connected and serious in themselves that perhaps the word play isn't the word that is appropriate. But anyway, I'm going to we'll keep working on who I'm being, because it would be easy to be offensive in many situations if you're frivolous. Thanks.
Lawrence, you.
Thanks. Yeah, I think play is an extremely important word. I also see it slightly differently, maybe than you, Mary, I'm not sure. But I think of Shakespeare's All the World's a Play, and the idea that there's always a play going on. I mean, as an astrologer, I'm always trying to figure out what is the play at this time. That means connectedness, as you just said. But it also means that we all have a role, and what is our role? And it also even ties back to what Catherine Elizabeth said. Why is this happening? And how do we respond to something horrible that keeps occurring? How do we keep our mood up and so on? So to me, that's also try to understand, well, what is that about? Why is this happening? I mean, the question to me is a very important one. What if this was part of something much more complex, and how could I understand it better if I did understand what it's connected to? What is the lesson here, for instance? So the idea of a play as a play that's going on, I think, is also a different part of the word.
Oak?
Somebody mentioned curiosity, and that's becoming a very key thought for me in entering both into the complexity and the we space and compassion, is that curiosity for me seems to be a portal for flowing down my mind, whatever judgments I'm holding, expectations, et cetera, and enter in with this a soft, the only word is curiosity, and that allows me to sense into the space, as well as be open to what somebody else might bring to the experience. And that particularly in groups where there's, I live in a small community, and there's so many different types of interactions with people who are completely from different social, political, economic things, and we all have to get along together, more or less, or I believe that. And the way that I tend to find that works where a we space is created is if I enter in with wanting to know more about the other. And regardless of where our intersections are, is that I feel more connected to them in a human space, or connected to a different group, or what have you, if I enter in with this sense of wonderment about what makes them tick, or what are the underlying. And I look particularly applying that to the political situation in the United States right now, and the rise of the Trump phenomena. And I probably have mentioned this before because I think about it quite a bit. And that it isn't that, you know, and I've spent a lot of time sitting in curiosity with it. And looking at not Trump himself as the phenomenon, because people like him exist everywhere at all times. So what is he tapping into? And being curious about the energies that that he is, there's something very central that he's tapping into that needs to be addressed. And looking at, you know, finally coming to understand that he's speaking to a group of people who, for whatever other ways we can look at it, this is a group that feels very disenfranchised and unheard. And I think a lot about how Rollo May's 5 ways of being, and how he discusses this having a sense of self and our sense of self-esteem at being recognized for who we determine ourselves to be, and the stages of increasing assertion, aggression, and violence when we don't feel heard. And so I've really been watching the political scene through Rollo May's lenses and seeing it, and with that curiosity and holding, it's like, what can I see that isn't my own opinion? And that this is a group that feels deeply, if it's a rise towards violence, I'm going to use Rollo May, that we can leap to the assumption that they feel deeply, deeply unheard. And the only way to be heard is, because words no longer work, the only way to be heard is action. And with that, this tremendous sense of compassion, whether I agree with it or not, or feel this is a group that is truly disenfranchised or whatever, I can see their sense of it, that something isn't being heard and recognized and given esteem in our political social world right now. And that only came to me, so I'm going to leap to the assumption that it's a bigger thing, that by entering into those places with curiosity, we can feel into the we space of what's happening in a much larger spectrum with much deeper human capacity of compassion. And out of that, begin to generate ways to solve that very deeply complex social issue. But without curiosity, I would still be sitting in judgment. And very deeply so. And it takes a lot of work to not be there all the time with this political phenomenon. So out of that, I start questioning myself and the environment, my local environment, and then the larger social environment, is what action can grow out of this? And is it just being able to speak that sense? And I've spoken it in different groups. I'm part of a group that meets every month to discuss compassion, and I brought it up in this group about listening deeply to other people's perspectives, curiosity, and it just did a little something in the group of some people of thinking that they're thinking now more deeply about what they're hearing rather than their own thoughts about what they're hearing. So taking that into, you know, a very large we space, how can, and I'm not doing this as a challenge, but really looking deeply at how can individual action then begin to address the disenfranchisement that we see all over the world right now. So, curiosity.
It's interesting because I think curiosity, and hi Kim, hi Jen, welcome. I think that curiosity and play are both ways of remaining free and open, right? There's a sense of not being stuck or fixed to a certain perspective, you know, or one's own identity perspective, and yet it's like, what is in play? You know, what are we playing with, and what are we curious about? And the answer to those questions will construct the we that one is looking to create. Because when I am as I think Mary, you said something about like taking something, really paying attention and taking something in, or Oak, you were speaking about being curious about someone else's experience. Really, what we're creating there is a possibility for an interpersonal we, right? Trying to create resonance or coherence at an interpersonal level. And one would assume that one is thinking, okay, if I do this, if we can function as a we if we can create some kind of resonance and coherence at an interpersonal level, through curiosity, through openness, through play, through an invitation, that out of that will emerge an outcome that would be beneficial to both. So the type of we space that we create depends on, one, what we think is possible, two, where we think the coherence needs to be created, and what kind of solutions need to emerge, right? And most often, I think for us as fairly sophisticated, psychologically aware, spiritually sensitive, postmodern-ish people, we're keen about creating that kind of resonance at an interpersonal level. And yeah,
Go ahead.
I would say, and there are other dimensions of resonance that we can be looking to work with. When Lawrence speaks about looking at the resonance with a kind of a higher archetypal reality, that's a different, that's not an interpersonal engagement. That's a different order of resonance and coming into alignment. I'm not sure. I would say you could call it an archetypal alignment, or an archetypal we space, a we space in which the archetypal reality is alive to us. And there's the one that we have been calling the higher we, where what our attention is on is the potentiality and process that is occurring between us. And that's a different kind of curiosity, a different kind of putting at play our identities to a different degree, and looking for an emergence at a different level than at an interpersonal, emotional kind of resonance level.
There's maybe one prerequisite that I would like to add, because it's helpful to talk about these different we spaces, because usually when we talk about we spaces, we don't make any differentiation.
Yeah, it's just the we.
It's just we, and usually people don't think too much about does it mean the same or are there different we spaces? Is this, and it clarifies the picture, I think, tremendously when one starts to think, oh, wait a moment, there are different forms of we, and it's interesting which one do I mean, because not every kind of we space is applicable in every situation, and maybe some forms of we spaces I'm more used to, and others I've outgrown,
Mm-hmm.
and some I'm not familiar with, because what needs to be in the picture that also you cannot easily, not everyone can see every form of we space easily. It needs a certain kind of development of personality and individuation to really cherish an interpersonal we space as you were describing it.
Mm-hmm.
In a pre-individuality culture, a we space looks different, because this kind of emphasis on individuation hasn't been developed. And for these cultures, it would be even difficult to imagine what this looks like, because the reference point is not the same. And in the same way, this, I mean, part of what we call the higher we, there is maybe something that is also beyond the interpersonal we space that has a different reference point, but that we are culturally not used to. And it's just interesting to see, does it even make sense to talk about these differences, and why is it important? Or maybe it is not important at all, because maybe one can say, as long as it's there's empathy and there's listening and there's a form of togetherness, that's basically what we need. So I would like to discuss if it's important to see these differences, or to stress these differences, or if this is something that is not of such an importance.
I'd like to jump in.
Mara.
Yeah, I think it is important, because I think that at least it has to do with what are you trying to solve, what are you trying to do with the we space, right? And if you are holding a problem that is bigger than us and bigger than our interpersonal relationships we believe can solve, and bigger than what any individual can do, I think it's important to know and be able to discern what needs to be in place in order to then transcend our everyday we space, our then very deep interpersonal we space, because we need to go into the creative matrix, essentially, right? So what is the way to enter into the creative matrix? And sometimes it just happens, right? Sometimes it just happens and flows, but sometimes you need to set the stage, because you need a very particular act to happen. So because you might be in dire need of a solution that is beyond where you've been able to get. So I guess in that way, I feel like it's important, and I think it's important to explore these more transcendent forms of collective, just so that we can begin at least finding more reliable, and instead of just leaving it to chance, continuing to find more reliable ways to enter into the spaces that we need.
That's very cool, Mara. I think that it's interesting, because I just want to, in thinking about the transcendent, they're not simply transcendent like disconnected. They're transcendent in larger embracing, and I think that that's really important, because it's not about. Because I think that I've noticed in some of the responses that people have, that transcendent feels kind of disconnected or dissociated often, and I think that has been the way certain religions and certain practices have kind of cultivated a sense of, let's space out and get out of here kind of response through higher forms of consciousness and so forth. But this is about a deeper, bigger, wider embrace that can work at a different order to solve. It doesn't solve my interpersonal relationship, perhaps, but it solves something. It begins up to allow things to emerge that hold different keys.
Yeah, Mara, Kim here. I want to thank you, because my connectivity is so bad I couldn't say kind of exactly what you were saying. I appreciate it, because what I was thinking is, yes, Elizabeth, there's actually 3 parts. I can be practicing in the interpersonal, in the intersubjective we, in that higher way. I can be practicing for my own needs. I also can be practicing in order to grow my leadership skills, so that I actually can then be practicing to explore what Mara was talking about how to actually figure that how to set that intentionality that's going to allow others and me to I'm going to say accomplish. So it's act that could be an action, but the action could just be the practice. But that third level of, if we're really there to solve a problem, then are we setting it up in a very loose way so that the whole thing is going to arise kind of spontaneously, whatever direction it does? Or are we as leaders trying to learn how to facilitate in a way that allows something to arise in a way that's a little bit more directioned and intentioned?
Mm.
I hope I made sense. I can't see anybody's face.
We're nodding.
You're nodding.
Okay, thank you.
Mm.
Thank you. Lawrence.
I'm going to jump. Yeah. So this is along the lines of what you said, Thomas. I believe when we create or step into or look to create a we space, it's not a blank sheet. In other words, there's already something there, and that changes all the time. It is what I call the quality of time. There are different kinds of time.
Mm-hmm.
And that matters tremendously, because if there is tension in the air, despite anybody there, because there's tension in the air, then it's going to be a different outcome than if there is harmony in the air. And I'm talking very generically here of that there are different qualities of time. And then the other part of that is that you talk about alignment. Somebody talked about, I think it was Elizabeth, talked about alignment. So my question is, when we go into a space and we're here to, let's say, facilitate a we space, who or what are we aligning ourselves to? If we step in and say, I have this goal, I'm going to go from A to B, it is an ego that we're aligning ourselves with. It's a will, it's something we're trying to create here. Yes, we can say we're opening up the space and anything can happen in the space, but we are creating with our egos that container. And so, and the other way would be, what if there's already something in the space that we could align ourselves with, which is what I'm much more interested in, which is the archetypal story that's going on all the time and in there. Because if we miss it or if we skip it, it becomes an ego trip in my mind.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, Lawrence, because let's just start with the quality of time. If I have our individual self-sense, usually we just think I am who I am, independent of whatever. If I just acknowledge the fact that time is not just time is also quality. There's a relationship between me and time when I'm open to that. That is very different, and there's also not necessarily in the sense me going from A to B, but there is that's what I love so much about the word emergence, because there's something emerging out of the quality of the space that is held by space itself, but also the space that we are holding, because there's a certain space that we are creating in this particular constellation that we are in, that is also not held by anyone particular, but we are holding it. And in that, there is an emergence, or at least the seed of an emergence, that dependent on us going with it can open up or not. And that is not an ego going from A to B. It's a surrender to the quality of time and the quality of being together and all of that. In some hand, it's more surrender than activity, although it needs my activity. But that changes the mindset completely. And we had a similar discussion yesterday in a group where we also talked about higher rework. And we talked it kind of in the context what language does to us. Just to see that we are so embedded in a subject-object language, where basically the relationship that I'm subject and you are object, even if because we are postmodern individuals, I see that you are an object that also has subjectivity, kind of, and we can connect in this. But somehow you are an object to me. That is so deeply embedded in the language that we are using, because it's basically that's the structure of the words, how it is created culturally over time. How can we create something different, and how can we even be creative with language to go with language to a different place that maybe opens up something different? These are also some things. It's much deeper than just being together in a so-called we space. That we really that we are rattling something in the structure of how we understand ourselves as culture. And I think these higher we spaces, they're more unsettling than they seem to look at the first glance, because they're more different than we think. And that's what I find exciting about it, because there's so much of our usual subject-object relationship, our ego-based relationship, that doesn't hold in this space. And in this kind of embrace of this we space, including also space itself and the quality of space, that there's a different quality of coming together. And I'm deeply convinced that it's something that we need culturally in order to make cultural change here. Anyway, what I mean to say is just that this we space has much more implications than it looks like when we just on a superficial level talk about we space.
Yeah. Yeah.
I just would like to comment on what you said, Thomas, about having the distinctions between the different kinds of we space, because if we have awareness of that, it gives us, and if we are curious about it, it gives us, I'm just going to use an object, a bigger toolbox with which we can play, and we can come into the situation with greater flexibility and curiosity, and that gives us the opportunity to be a greater influence on the culture's invisible structures, including, whether it's psychological or emotional or political or whatever. Exactly.
Yeah, I think that's great, Mari, because the thing is, those invisible structures are us. They're not. Sometimes we like to talk about them as objects outside of ourselves, but when it's the potential of this kind of, once we get beyond the interpersonal we space and get to a trans-individuation, or where we're starting to work with the subjectivity that is not just how I feel over here, but is about something that is being co-created in and between us, and that there is something actually real there. We start, the fundamental senses by which we know ourselves start to unravel a bit. And the more deeply one goes, actually, I'm sure Barbara's nodding, and I'm sure that in her work with, with different forms of sentience, you realize that knowing is coming back at you and is challenging how you know who you are. And we can do that as human beings together to reach something, to then be able to work these core structures. And that may be our best way in to be trying to challenge some of the core fundaments that are creating the system as it is that we're all trying to change. Yeah, Barbara, did you want?
I just wanted to say one quick thing about what you just said, Elizabeth, because it was funny when you said that about it being us, and I had in my mind, even though I didn't say the word, that the invisible structures include the whole community.
Well, I've had this question in my mind to speak for some time here, and it's really relevant. I love that you know that I've encountered these other forms of sentience, and of course they're not using our language, and it's terrifying to have such a challenge to find out that they know what you're thinking and feeling at all times. There's no hiding. But my question, which isn't going to be expressed quite as elegantly, say, as Lawrence would or somebody, but is about almost the ethics of entering a higher we space or being tuned into it. I have known times when I could, for example, when things aren't going well, I can enter that higher space myself and bring as much love and compassion and well-wishing to whoever is having a hard time around me as possible, and it can really alter what's happening. But is that ethical when you're not including, you're almost doing it to someone, offering them a healing or offering them a better space in a higher we space that they may not consciously or be entering or have agreed to enter with you? Is there any question of ethics in that?
That's it.
I have to jump in on that. I'm sorry, but I have to. This is to me the issue of the Mormon Church going around and and posthumously baptizing people so that they get into heaven. I find that incredibly invasive, and I think no, we do not have the right to step into someone else's place. We can make suggestions and ask, but we cannot just do it because we know better. I mean, I have very strong feelings about that.
What about purely sending them love? And
that's fine. That's different than quote unquote
manipulate.
Yeah.
Barbara and Lawrence, if I can jump in, it's Christy. One of the things Gene Houston had recommended at one time is have your entelechy talk to their entelechy and ask permission if you don't want to have an in-person conversation.
Yeah, that's.
But it is interesting because when one can sometimes create these spaces and the people in them respond to them without knowing what's going on, and that there's a response and there's a positive response, but they are not aware of certain dimensions that when one is doing it or one is engaging with them. I mean, I had this experience at one point with a classroom teaching, doing just a small guided meditation. And the group was not aware of that part of the room became silent and a depth opened up. And afterwards they couldn't remember it. And they didn't know that they were part of it. But when I pointed out what happened, they said, "Oh, yes, that happened." But there was the structures in their consciousness, in their mind, their developmental structures of cognitive structures, what self structures, were not at a point where they could cognize this, where they could say, "Yes, I can hold this and see this, that there was a me that was continuous through this, or there was a self that was happening here that went someplace else."
Would it be different to think of it as, you can differently connect into a we space, whether you're connecting with your mind or with your heart makes a difference. Purely with your heart field, does that connect? But I see your point perfectly, of course. But would it make a difference? Or is there a difference?
Yeah, Barbara, that's really cool. And what comes up for me is Lawrence, when you were talking about the ego and that defining the space. I keep talking about leadership, you guys. Sorry, but that's the name of our program. Leadership and social transformation. So I always am trying on these garments of what we're practicing and seeing how it feels and then how that actually works out, how it looks in practice. And so this question of ethics, Barbara, is terrific because, Elizabeth, to your point, one doesn't ever know one's audience. You don't know the developmental level or the capacity of people in your audience. And so we're always, at least I hope you guys see this in me, I always am trying to bring my best self, my most conscious self, to whatever occasion is presenting itself. And, some days that's pretty awful because that's just the best I can do that day. But, my intention is to be the best I can in that circumstance, which means I need to practice and actually need to think through these in my preference, the way I do things, which is not the way that other people do. But I think the question of ethics is big, and at the same time, that phrase "oak" that we use, you only know what you know. That all winds together in an actuality of we all are trying to learn more, so we have greater capacity, so we can make better decisions in any moment.
Oak?
Yeah, I'd like to jump back into something that Tomas said a little bit ago about the type of subject-object language we have. And I think it applies to a lot of what's been said since. When Tomas said that, I started thinking about the different types of cultural languages there. There are some that are verb-based. And rather than always speaking of I, we, you, they, it's action. And that led me, trying to sense into that. It's like, well, what does speech look like or sound like when you're only speaking from a verb-based language? And it occurred to me that it automatically presumes a we space. When you're speaking only from acting, it's a presumption that we are feeling together.
Mm-hmm. Those are mostly pre-individuated cultures.
Yeah, and yet we talk about moving into like the trans-individuated space. Is that I even wonder about like doing an exercise in a rather than pre-individuated space of sensing into and only speaking from our sensing place in verbs, and what that might look like if we actively started generating a form of language that spoke from a we space verb-based linguistic form, even if only as an exercise, what that might generate in the participants.
Cool. You should try that.
I'm going to.
I think this exercise to try to develop this language is something that is basically what we are trying to attempt to create a different culture. Because you only create a different culture that has a hold in something if you're also developing language with it. And the way I understand our rework is that when you develop a sensitivity for a we space between us, then in this we space there is a sensitivity of a resonance field, and there is an intuitive awareness of something that is not language. And every time when I feel that we are together in something that has this space, an intuitive base, something, a resonance field, one can start to experiment with language, because all of a sudden you can use language and you see, wait a moment, it falls in resonance with this we space that we are in. And in that, I always find that the new forms of wording emerge, but it doesn't come out of language itself. It comes out of a collective recognition of something beyond or before language, however you want to call this. And a big part of what this work is about is to create a sensitivity. I think it's really a sensitivity training also for something. That is a reality that is not individual based. It's we space based. To become aware, there's something we can start to sense into that is accessible or true to all of us. It's really in this in-between space, and as we are talking about it, we have simultaneously access to it. And in situation where this is strongly a felt sense in a group, you really can start to work with language, because then you have a reference point beyond language to develop language. And I think that's that's the exercising ground to really develop in a very micro scale, admitting a new culture. But a lot of TV work, I think, is based on this, to create a sensitivity of this, and then see how can we create understanding, which means also language around this.
Thomas, you've shared with us on these calls, and also we've learned in some of our other courses, for example, some of the distinctions in German that I think make some conversations along these lines more discerning and include more complexities. And I have a book written by Native American women called Reinventing the Language of the Enemy. So I think that Oaks bringing language in is extremely important. And I think that the language of the culture, whether it is a tribal culture or a culture that's as far along as the Germanic culture or any other culture, I think that language has a huge influence on how these spaces emerge.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
That's right. Mara, you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, and I believe this is all still related, and I wanted to speak a little bit to what Barbara was bringing up about ethics and about when looking at trans-individuated we spaces. I almost feel like, and this is based on my experience, so I could be totally wrong, but it almost feels like it's not possible to enter into that we space. I don't believe you have access to that we space if you're wanting to manipulate, or with where you're at is not in alignment with what is emerging in that we space of what is there. It almost feels like, I don't know, it feels like not possible to me, right? To be manipulating in that way when in that space. And it could be that the individual that has those intentions or those desires is not able to enter the space in the same way as others.
That's actually, I would definitely agree with that, and that certain kinds of egoic motivations are like walls in terms of one's access to the subtlety and drive and motivation and intelligence of that space. However, even at I think at lower levels of that, there still are differences that in which one's motivations work. And I think that this is why I would say that having collectives work together and in order to purify motivation and purify one's intention, that there's work that needs to be done at that level together as a kind of supervisory or kind of co-supervisory, practice to it. Not only does that develop one's capacity for engagement in this kind of subtlety, makes that more robust, but it also keeps one's nose clean, and which I think is very, very important when we're dealing with these things. Even though what you say, I think, is true.
Now, what comes to my mind is Habermas' distinction of a domination-free communication. Because what you're describing is very interesting. I haven't thought about this in this way. What you're describing is a form of a dominated we space. One could describe it. I've never used the word before, but it's kind of what you describe. It's a dominated we space, but I think the foundation of a higher we space is its co-creative nature, and that brings the ethical dimension in, because it's out of respect and also equal co-creation that this we space really becomes, in that sense, a we space. Otherwise, there's this imposition nature of it, which we do know. There can be we spaces that are basically dominated by a dominator, but because of the manipulative power of someone, it forms the whole we space. But it's dependent on the dominance of someone's egoic capacity to hold something in this we space.
And it could be thrilling.
It could be thrilling, and it could be also mistaken as a we space. Maybe if someone is kind of smart and sensitive enough, one can manipulate it that it doesn't look like being dominated. But to make this distinction, that there's a possibility of a domination-free we space, I think is a very interesting thought to pursue, because this is what we are talking about.
Well, and actually you said a little before something about surrender, and it's that in the we space that we're in this co-creative we space, it's like the deeper ones surrender to this delicate life force, this delicate but I mean, it's created the universe, force is the and one's ability to be out of the way of that and to submit to that is what brings it more and more alive between us. So it's paradoxical. It's the movement of ego in that space is you don't get anywhere. It's your surrender to that which is arising between us, that which does make possibility possible between us is what is called for. So there's, at this level, there's an ethics built in, and yet for it to really be what it is and develop and have juice, it needs that channel needs to constantly be clean for each participant, each person yeah.
And that can be the tricky part, I think, with the ethics is because someone may be unconscious actually about how much, let's just say, an egoic, I'm going to call it a persona, might actually be part of their dominant structure. And surrender to the spirit of discovery so that one and the group can be tuning into that delicate life force. Boy, that's a fine, fine art.
That's right.
Right.
That's right. Jennifer.
I was late today because I was meeting for a 1-hour meeting with this group that we were talking about we spaces, and it ended up being a 3-hour dialogue when I thought it was going to be a 1-hour dialogue. And we actually went through the process of talking about what we're talking about. The basis of it is in that Rust Belt area I've mentioned before, artistic economic development and artist district in the downtown area. And the group members asked me over and over about how to have a dialogue that actually then works to action and includes all in the language of the dialogue. And we got to talk about who is always missing at the table in the dialogues and how many dialogues they've had and accountability. And it was very interesting for me to listen to the languages of theys, to the recognition that they were using the word they and then bringing it back to themselves. And I was working towards the next dialogue where I wanted to be able to create, and thanks Lawrence who met with me earlier to help me, to create a space where we can have ideas towards action, but in a we space dialogue that we're coming in to be open to the ideas that all will bring in and how we can connect them to a purpose without having to have the outcome already put on a piece of paper and shown to people who may be showing up. That it's the process of the dialogue that will bring forth what the next steps will be. And it was a very good conversation. and an ability to hold the space. And that's actually what they asked me to do. Would you be able to hold that space so that we can do this? Because it's difficult to hold a space and not just focus on the next steps, but then nobody goes to the next steps. They meet in committee, they do. So, I was practicing what you were talking about. So it was really good, and excited about our next meeting. And what was even more exciting is that I was using terminology I have learned for the last 3 years and sharing authors. And so Kim, leadership does, it can be put into practice. And there were Googling and finding, and so I was excited about it. So I just wanted to share, but it was all of what we were talking about, and we are going to move into action and how to get to that creative action in there. So
great. I'm glad that you brought in the topic of holding space. You know, I think that's kind of a thing these days, holding space. But it's like, what is that? You know, what is it to have one's attention on something other than the content? And I think in a lot of groups it's true that it's quite an art to be able to not get seduced by content and be able to have one's attention on the field of consciousness, the quality of the field itself, and to be able to see where that is moving and where it's stuck and what needs to happen with that. But I think some groups are now getting people who come in and sit and hold space. Somehow you have to be part of the facilitation process at the same time, I think, in order for it to really work. Yeah. Lawrence.
I think that's where ritual comes in. I think how people are sitting, how you open the space, how you close the space, how you sacralize the space. I think all of that is very, very important to make it work. And so for instance, one of my friends is Mark Rylance, who just won an Oscar for Bridges of Spies. He was the spy. And he's considered the greatest Shakespearean actor in England. And I've watched him when he goes on, before he does a play, he goes on the stage and he sacralizes it. He literally creates the space, the magic space, the circle, the temenos, whatever you want to call it. And when he's done, he closes it because he strongly believes that he's inviting in all these energies that are playing with him. And he's terrified to let that loose. So he spends a lot of time afterwards in meditation, closing it all down. And that's what creates some incredible space for everybody to participate in. And he's won 2 Tony Awards as in Foreigner, that's on Broadway, which is unheard of as Best Actor, like within 3 years. So he's extraordinary in that capacity. And it's all based on this idea that there is an already present world, an archetypal world that is pulling in to play with.
And play with him.
Yeah, to play with him, and he plays with them and the other actors. But the we space is enriched by what's already present. And so he invites that in by opening the space to that and then closes it back out again because he doesn't want to mess with it when he goes home.
That's great.
Lawrence, what you're saying, and Elizabeth and Jen, the word that comes to mind for this is bounding the space. And so that it's both opening to it and then setting a boundary for what else can enter, and then releasing it back out, and the capacity for a ritual to do that. And I think about times when I've been very fortunate to have been participated over a number of years in different Native American sweat lodges. And that is a very bounded and ritual space that's also deeply expansive, and it's a deeply profound we space. But sometimes as a participant, that one's job is to hold the space for other people to experience something. And sometimes it's to move with somebody who's experiencing, and sometimes it's to experience oneself. And so within that facilitated we space, there's the leader who who creates the space, but participants at different levels of awareness, either consciously entering into it that way, knowing that that's their role, or sensing into that role of being there to hold the space specifically so others can go deeper. And it brings into context the whole thing about in facilitating groups, of having somebody there whose job is specifically to attend to the space. And, you know, as part of a facilitation team, could that be a planned role, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
There's a leadership structure called 8 Shields leadership that actually, that is one of the roles that they have as part of their leadership structure. They have someone who is, that is that person's role. And it is based on some Native American cultural practices.
Great.
Talking about bounding,
Yeah.
maybe we should do some bounding
Some boundary.
ritual.
I want to say I'm really going to miss these calls. I've gotten so much. These calls have been so rich. I just want to say that.
Thanks, Mary.
Thank you.
Thanks. It's been great to meet you. It feels like we've met, but it's been a great experience.
No, I appreciate it very much. It was a rich experience on this side too.
Yeah.
Very much so.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I look forward to seeing how your projects develop. Very exciting. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Shall we?
Yeah.
We'll unmute.
Bye.
We'll unmute.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Comments?
you.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Much appreciation.
Yeah.
Wonderful space.
Really.
Yeah.
Take care.
Bye. You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.